It's important anytime that taxpayer money is used for anything. I think it's important for people to know where that money is going and how that money is spent.
I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. A quick reminder to support programs like this one by becoming a sustaining member at NEFAC.org/join. With your support, we can continue to share stories about local journalism through our First Amendment and Free Press series. We can continue to pull back the newsroom curtain, explain how journalists do their job, and discuss ways reporters and editors can better cover the communities they serve. Help us continue doing this by becoming a sustaining member today. NEFAC.org/join. Thank you. I'm here with Viktoria Sundqvist, newsroom data analyst for Hearst Connecticut. Viktoria, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Viktoria recently used the Connecticut Public Records Law to report stories on superintendent pay and contracts. This type of reporting not only highlights the value of public records in local journalism, but it provides a good opportunity for all of us to learn more about how the law works and how all of us, whether we're in a newsroom or not, can best use that law to learn more about government. Viktoria, can you start us off by telling us a bit more about these stories, what you reported, and what you found out?
Sure. So we did two stories. We started out by requesting contracts for all public school superintendents in Connecticut for the 2020 and 2021 school year, the one that is ending in about a week. We received the contracts, read through all the contracts. I posted them online to Document Cloud, where it's easy to sort of work through and annotate different things in the contracts that stand out. And the main story we did was looking at the salary. So comparing the salary for each superintendent, reporting on who made the most money, and then comparing the average salary to the various different districts. You know, there are smaller districts, there are regional districts, there are some part-time districts as well. So we were looking at the differences in pay. Then we did a separate story looking at random things that stood out in the contracts as a little bit unusual. You know, there are certain things that everybody has in their contract, that superintendents have to be certified, for example, that most of them have to submit to medical exams. But then there are other things like they would get longevity bonuses, they would get moving expenses, they would get travel stipends. Two of the superintendents got job coaches to help them perform their jobs better. So we did a separate story looking at that and what some of those unusual things were and why they would be needed. And finally, we built a database to put all the contracts into, and people can search for the superintendent, they can look at their districts, and they can sort it by pay and see who makes the most money.
Tell us about the origins of this reporting. What kind of conversations did you have in the newsroom to even identify this as a possible story to share?
So I had actually done something similar about 8 years ago. We had talked about, updating that and looking at where superintendents are moving to and from, because there's a lot of superintendents that stay in Connecticut but move around from district to district. And we decided it would be easiest to just do the whole thing over because it's been so long. So we just, start over, request the documents from every single superintendent. So I identified the school districts again. I had most of them from the last time around, but since then a few of them have consolidated. So there's some regional districts. And then within the regional districts, some have their own superintendent in the smaller towns. So just kind of identifying how many districts are we working with, how many different superintendents, getting their email addresses, putting everything in a spreadsheet, and then sending out a request to each superintendent directly, asking them, can you send me a copy of your contract with the district? And then I tracked it in the same spreadsheet and just said, how quickly did they respond? Right? Because that's what we want to know. I need to know, did they respond so I can follow up with them?
Tell me why specifically this story? What's important about this information that you think the communities should know?
I think it's important anytime that taxpayer money is used for anything, I think it's important for people to know where that money is going and how that money is spent. And I think nobody's saying that superintendents aren't doing their job or aren't earning their keep. In fact, most people we spoke to for the story said it's a really hard job, and they compare it with being the CEO of a large organization, and they need to pay superintendents a certain amount of money for them to stay in the district and do their job accordingly. But it helps identify discrepancies between different towns. It helps identify other issues. And for example, you might, if you're living in a town, you might be very interested in what your specific superintendent is making, and to be able to compare that with another town of similar size is really good. And especially for many districts who are looking for a new superintendent for the upcoming year. And if you're participating in that process and maybe watching the Board of Education meetings and they're talking about money and perks, and you don't know what to compare that to. You don't know if that's a good deal or a bad deal. It might sound good to you to get 20 vacation days or 30 vacation days, but if most of the districts give a superintendent 40 vacation days, they're not necessarily going to come work in your town. So I think it's good for the public. With transparency, it's good to know that you can see this information, know that it is public information, that anybody can really walk into or email or call their superintendent's office and ask for this information.
All right. So through this reporting, we have a better understanding as to whether or not the money we're paying superintendents is justifiable. It provides some more context for other communities to compare what they're paying their superintendents and to ask and answer the same questions. So there's a lot of public interest in this type of information and transparency. All of that being said, it must have taken quite a bit of time to make all of these public records requests, get the responses, get all of this information, compile it, and then provide it in a way that's accessible to all these communities. So before I have you, tell us about the process specifically, how long did the news gathering process, the reporting process take in totality?
So I would say about 5 months. I started February 22nd, sending out the initial request, and then tracked them, sent out several reminders, and then people who didn't submit their responses, I also contacted their HR person, or I found out who their secretary or assistant was and tried to reach out to them. There were, of course, a lot of different smaller issues, with some people are working from home still because of the pandemic. Some people were out sick. Some people had spam filters where, half of the emails don't come through when you request something. So it's really good to cast a wider net and sort of say, hey, did your superintendent see this message? Maybe you can help me nudge them along on this request. And we started February 22nd, and I got the last two contracts on June 1st.
So a 5-month process, which began with just making the request. What does that look like? For those that have never filed a public records request before, what does it entail? How do you make that request for this type of information?
So in Connecticut, it's actually really simple. You do not have to use a special form, even though some districts do want you to use a special form. They can't really require you to do that. So just sending an email, you don't even have to say specific words. You obviously have to include what you're looking for, what time frame you're looking for something. So they know how to find those documents. If it's a document that is publicly available, like I already know that superintendent contracts exist, are publicly available, they should be able to provide it fairly quickly and respond to that. Like I said, a couple of districts said, well, we have this special form, would you mind filling out this form? And you have to, retype the information you already asked for. Again, you don't have to do it. You can tell them, no, you have to provide it to me anyway, but it helps the process along, and it's not that hard. If you think it's going to speed up the process, it helps the district track the requests. I don't really mind, putting it in a special format if it helps them out to get it to me faster. So I was willing to do that in this regard, but it's really important to know that they cannot require you to jump through a ton of hoops to get information that you're entitled to have.
And despite those, I guess, smaller hoops that they ask you to jump through, were there any major challenges to getting this information, or did all of the agencies you reach out to realize payroll information, this is public records 101, shouldn't be an issue, isn't an issue, here you go? What was your experience?
There were a couple of people who asked, like, why are you looking for this? There was one person who wanted me to clarify who I was and why I was asking for this, because they thought it was a spam request or that I was trying to steal their personal information. There were also a couple of contracts we received that were marked confidential, clearly labeled confidential across the top, but they gave them to me. They did not put up a fight about it. So at some point, somebody thought it was confidential and marked it as such, but they realized that it wasn't, and we're going to give them out. So I don't think there were any major hurdles, excuse me, in this regard. They were, the biggest thing was the timing, getting them in a timely manner, making sure they had seen the request, making sure they were working on the request. And under Connecticut law, there is no time limit for providing a document. An agency has to respond to acknowledge your request within 4 days, and then they have to provide it without undue delay. So, fairly quickly, subjective term. What does that mean, especially if you're down 3 people in your office, don't have access to your office? How long can you drag your feet? And I think I probably would have had grounds to file complaints against some of these districts, but it's easier to just remind them 1 or 2 or 3 more times and sort of try to get them to comply, because filing a complaint is pretty tedious in itself.
Were there any surprises in what you found through your reporting? If you could give me just a couple takeaways from the stories, what would they be?
Well, I think we had 3 superintendents who made more than $300,000. That was a little surprising. The average was just over $200,000 per year, and that includes the annuity that they get, which is like a tax sheltered thing that gets taken out of their salary and put aside. Some of the perks that stood out were, again, the job coaches that I had mentioned, and that is apparently a fairly new provision that some superintendents are asking for in their contracts. So I spoke to an attorney who helps write contracts, and he said that he's seeing more and more of that. And the understanding is, everybody wants a superintendent to succeed. It's a very tedious process to start finding a superintendent and starting over and building that relationship with somebody. So the longer they can get somebody to stay in a district, the better it is for the district, as long as they have a good working relationship. So there may seem like districts are jumping through a lot of hoops to get a superintendent to come, to get them to stay. But they're saying that it's worth it because it keeps them in the district and it makes them competitive to other districts. So I learned a lot about that, a lot about how long their process is for finding a superintendent, probably longer than the process of putting together this project. Those were some of the interesting things. I guess the other thing, one last thing, there were several superintendents who live out of state, especially if they're on the border, like for Rhode Island and Massachusetts. So that was interesting to me, because some towns on the other end of the spectrum require a superintendent to live in the district where they're working.
Before we wrap up here, any plans for a follow-up?
Yeah, so I've been working with a lot of the local editors and a lot of the local reporters to see what specifically can they do with this data in their own towns. There are a lot of districts who are looking for new superintendents for the fall. They're probably, they may be hired mid-year. They may not have them in place by September. But, what does that look like now for those districts based on the information and the salary that we know other superintendents are making? We're also going to look a lot at the lack of diversity among superintendents and how the pay corresponds with that and then the different districts. And looking more at the superintendent's salary as part of the total school district budget. So does that vary if, you know, a district has $250 million and the superintendent makes $100,000, for example? That's probably a bad example, but you know, how does that compare from city to city and some of the smaller towns and suburbs versus cities?
Great. Well, we look forward to all of your future reporting, and thank you again for the great work you're doing at Hearst, Connecticut.
Thank you for having me.